Nice to see everyone here. My name is Gen, and I'm the chapter president for MIT Enterprise Forum New York. Thank you for joining us this evening at this panel for smart urban planning for post-COVID cities. As someone who lives in New York and who have been here for almost 10 years at this point, this topic is of particular interest for me, and I do think that a lot of guests today will find this event particularly interesting as well. Before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a bit about MIT Enterprise Forum. We're a nonprofit with a focus on supporting the tech and entrepreneurship community here in New York and also around the country. We have chapters around the world as well. We regularly organize these workshops, thought leadership panels, and fireside chats, and our annual membership pass is available for those who want to attend multiple events. You can learn more about that in our website. All right, without further ado, let me introduce our panel and moderator, Oliver.
Thank you very much, gang. And my name is Oliver Schaper. I'm a principal at Gensler, and we are an integrated architecture, design, planning, and consulting firm with over 50 offices worldwide. I lead our global cities and urban design resilience efforts, and I'm based in New York City. It's my absolute pleasure to moderate today's panel and the conversation about smart urban planning and post-COVID cities. After I'll introduce the panelists, we'll take about 30 minutes for a panel discussion before we open it up to questions for the audience. But please feel free along the way to collect your questions, post them into the Q&A box. We'll make sure to reserve ample time to answer as many questions as you have. So before we start our conversation, please allow me to introduce our esteemed panelists, Bomee Jung, Alison Novak, and Courtney Jung. For more than 17 years, Bomee Jung has contributed to New York City's climate leadership through policy and programmatic innovations. As the inaugural vice president for energy and sustainability at NYCHA, she led the development and implementation of public housing's most ambitious 10-year strategic sustainability plan, including a $700 million program for energy performance contracts, $300 million heat and hot water electrification program, and a 25 megawatt community solar program, and the city's first new pneumatic waste collection system in 47 years. Prior to NYCHA, she designed and led the climate mitigation and adaptation programs for the New York Office of Enterprise Community Partners, a national leader in green affordable housing. Bomee holds a master in city planning degree from MIT, and she serves on the boards of the New York Passive House and the Institute for Market Transformation. Welcome to the panel, Bomee. Then we have Courtney Jung. Courtney is an urban planner with a passion for helping cities become more inclusive and vibrant with better technology and policies. She's currently the Director of Economic Development at VIA, where she's developing innovative partnerships to transform land use and improve economic development through new mobility and technology offerings. Previously, Courtney was the head of business development and strategy at Remix, where she worked with over 300 transit agencies and city departments of transportation across the world to develop technology solutions that dramatically improve the planning process while enabling greater exploration and public engagement. Courtney launched the urban development practice at Chemonics International, a consulting firm implementing international development projects in over 60 countries. She wrote for the Brookings Institution on housing and land use and developed master urban plans for Hong Kong, Singapore, and Bangkok with MIT. She's also the founding member of Sidewalk Laboratory at MIT's Department of Urban Studies and Planning, where she developed cartography experiments, economic analysis to map over 100 street vendors, sidewalk life, and public squares. She has a master's and bachelor in city planning from MIT and is originally from the Boston area and is currently enjoying the outdoors while living in San Francisco. And last but certainly not least, Alison Novak, the head of Sidewalk urban development, and has overseen acquisition, design, and financing and construction completion of a wide range of housing developments, ranging from affordable to high-end home ownership to rental, single family to high-rise. She has over 15 years of real estate development experience. Prior to Sidewalk, she was a principal at one of New York's premier residential development firms, the Hudson Companies, And under her leadership, Hudson launched its commitment to green building, its first equity investment funds, and its internal committee for equity, inclusion, and diversity. Alison studied community development at Grinnell College and earned her Master of City Planning and Master of Science in Real Estate Development, both from MIT. She's also Vice Chair of Women in Housing and Finance and a member of the 21st Cohort of Co-Road Leadership New York, and sits on the board of the Osborne Association. Alison's from Iowa, and she has lived on both coasts while now calling Brooklyn home. So welcome to all of you. And we thought that perhaps you all should take a few minutes to take over the screen and tell us a little bit about what you do and what you're currently concerned with, and what you would like to discuss high level as part of this conversation. And I thought we're going to start with Bomee, and then Courtney and Alison. And Bomee, if you would like to take over the screen and make sure to unmute yourself.
And I forgot to unmute, and it was the wrong screen. Let's see.
Yeah, we saw it screen for a moment, and then it turned back.
Sorry. Are you seeing the PowerPoint one now? Okay, great. So thank you for having me. This is a lot of fun. I just wanted to note that I have actually just left NYCHA. So I am now just on day 3 of being no longer a part of the team at the Housing Authority, but nonetheless, the Housing Authority continues to occupy a big space in my head and my heart. It is the largest landlord in the United States and indeed in North America. It owns more apartments than any other owner, not only within public housing, but just across the board. It is also, just because of its size and its importance in the landscape for affordable housing, it is, oh, here we go. It has been a real honor to be able to work at NYCHA over the last almost 6 years. And when I started, I was brought in to start by putting together a comprehensive sustainability agenda, which my team came out with in 2016. And that was an agenda that looked at all aspects of sustainability from an owner's perspective. So it looked at our energy, it looked at waste management, it looked at our sites, it looked at indoor environmental quality. And then over the course of the next 5 years, my team worked on a variety of different standards that supported the comprehensive agenda, including a clean fleet plan, a comprehensive waste management plan, which is also now being implemented, as well as looking at climate adaptation issues like how to deal with high heat. But most recently, in the last year and change before leaving NYCHA, I was working on a roadmap to look at how do we reduce our greenhouse gas footprint 80% by 2050, which is what is required by Local Law 97. So Local Law 97 is New York's version of building energy performance legislation. There are 5 other localities that have similar building performance laws in place. New York's works by looking at the greenhouse gas intensity per square foot. And although NYCHA is treated a little differently, we have a little bit more flexibility. See, I had not out of the habit of saying we yet. Although NYCHA has a little bit more flexibility than private owners, NYCHA still has to meet greenhouse gas limits by 2030 and by 2050. So what this plan looked at is, oops, no, I went backwards. So what it looked at was, how do we use existing technologies of today to get to that point, and how far can we go with the technologies that are in place in the portfolio in the 2,600-ish buildings that NYCHA owns? How much of it will entail really major surgery, changing technology for heat and hot water primarily? So I encourage you to go and download the report if you're interested. It's got, it's not super long. It's about, I think it's about 80 some odd pages total, including appendices, but it has a lot of really good information that I think is applicable not only to NYCHA, but really any residential portfolio. But in a nutshell, the takeaway would be that there are a number of different ways to get to a really aggressive portfolio-wide goal like that for an owner like NYCHA, but that basically all of them involve a substantial amount of electrification. And electrification, depending on the city and the state meeting the goals to have a low carbon grid in place for electricity. So the last thing I did before leaving the authority was managing a large-scale electrification program, which covered of the 126 buildings and 10,000 apartments. The program that I was overseeing covered 8 of those developments, so about 7,000 units. It is currently being awarded, so these are real projects that are going to start construction about the middle of this year. And so, really the point here is 2 things. One is that large-scale electrification is doable. This was a real learning experience for all of us who were working on this project. There were some challenges that we expected, some challenges that we didn't know we were going to get. So there's definitely a learning curve involved. And we didn't actually get all of the technology innovations that we hoped we would get. But it's certainly a big difference between not having done a large-scale electrification program and having crossed that threshold as a public housing authority and as the largest residential owner. And so just on a closing note, I guess, if I had to think about, well, what is the post-COVID smart city, whatever the post-COVID smart city may be, it needs to be a climate adaptive city. This is the crisis that we were facing before the pandemic. It is the crisis that we are continuing to face. And so I think, everything else has, I think, sharpened the focus in certain ways, particularly in the building sector, about what constitutes quality housing. But at the end of the day, a smart city is a climate adaptive city. So if anyone wants to get in touch with me, that's my email address.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very, very fascinating, and certainly a lot more to unpack in the course of this conversation. Courtney, you want to go next? Take over the screen.
Sure. Thanks, Bomee. That was super interesting. I'm like the lone non-New Yorker on this call, so I'll try my best to represent the West Coast. Hey, everyone, I'm Courtney Sung. As mentioned, I currently work at VIA. I'm going to kind of wear 2 hats today, talk a little bit more about Remix, which has been my life for the last 6 years, and then end with a little bit more sort of context about VIA and how sort of Remix and VIA fit together and why that's relevant for today's conversation. So can everyone see the screen okay? All right, so fun fact, actually, Remix is a transportation planning startup. We are the collaborative platform for transportation decision-making. And it was actually co-founded by one of my dear friends from undergrad at MIT, also from Course 11, Dasper, Course 4 and Course 11, Tiffany Shu. And we actually have quite a few MIT folks as well from Course 6, Course 11, all sorts of places. So it's been a really fun sort of experience over the last few years. But let me talk about sort of Remix, COVID, everything, and like what we've been thinking about. So I think obviously transportation has been one of the things that has been affected the most during COVID. I think in San Francisco, at least, there have been a lot of slow streets and people changing transportation patterns as everyone, ceases to go into work, at least temporarily. And what we've seen is kind of 2 main trends, right? So one, transit agencies have to really adapt. They have totally different ridership. They're doing essential services for people who have to go into the grocery store or the hospital. And they're trying to deal with various different funding situations, not knowing what their ridership is going to look like in the future. Policy is changing all the time. And so I think it's really forced a level of planning activity that, for those of you not in the transportation planning world, is pretty unprecedented. Like, in the past, we were talking about maybe quarterly planning, usually a 3 to 5 year plan, usually 20 years in the future. So the scale and rapidness of it has really changed. I think this also applies to DOTs and cities who are dealing with urban space. So hopefully most of you have eaten outdoors at some sort of restaurant that closed down the street, or maybe the whole street was closed down. I live on a street in the Mission in San Francisco where chunks of the street are actually closed off to cars on the weekend to facilitate outdoor dining. There's some streets that closed down due to social distancing. Cities are really kind of forced to leverage tactical urbanism and new pilot projects to experiment and also to protect their residents. And this is also happening kind of at a pace that's been not used to in the past. And one thing I want to highlight for folks, if you haven't worked in a transit agency or a city DOT or a transportation planning agency, A lot of times the tools you have are really out of date. So I don't know if anyone can actually guess where this is from. This is actually from the New York City MTA. This is how they used to plan transit, right? So they had a piece of paper, maybe some trace, a massive Excel spreadsheet with like 200 tabs. Maybe you use ArcGIS or some sort of mapping software, but it's a really cumbersome, totally paper-based process. And as you can imagine, we all start working from home. How are you going to do this in a world where you don't even have your work computer anymore? So that's been something we've been trying to help with at Remix for the last 5 or 6 years. As Oliver mentioned, we work with over 350 local governments, cities, transit agencies of all sizes. So the New Yorks and the Londons and San Franciscos of the world, and also very small transit agencies. My favorite is a 5-bus transit agency in a national park in Canada that we work with. So all different sizes, all different transportation problems. We have several products that actually are for planners to use. So transit planning software, street design software, mobility management, that's like bikes and scooters, and then data analysis, which I'm sure Alison and I will have a lot to talk about later. And just one example for you before I kind of wrap up here, MTA is actually using Remix to help redesign several of their bus networks. One example that I think is particularly salient during COVID, I'm sure most of you experienced the New York subway shutdown, which had never happened before. You know, suddenly you have no subway service from 1 to 5 a.m. So they actually had to plan sort of emergency bus routes and bus bridges to respond to that. And it was a very last minute thing. They actually used Remix to plan that replacement bus service over the course of one weekend. And we saw very similar stuff happening with other transit agencies in San Francisco and so on. So we feel that being able to plan more nimbly and adaptively is pretty crucial to helping cities recover. And some of the things that we've been working on to support that is actually making working remotely and public engagement more effective. So you can actually now do public engagement and commenting in Remix. It's kind of think like Google Docs or Slack for maps. You can actually resolve issues, make it geotagged. I think this is very exciting stuff. As someone who had to use GIS in the past, this is pretty cool direction. And some of you are wondering, why was Remix recently acquired by VIA? Some of you may have experienced VIA's consumer services in New York City. What you may not know is actually VIA has sort of begun working with transit agencies all around the world to actually take that technology and power more on-demand public transit. So all sorts of things from paratransit and demand response. I will flip through this slide, but you can see they're actually doing a lot of stuff, everything from school buses and fixed route to paratransit, corporate shuttles. And so VIA is actually really thinking about how to make the transportation experience more seamless and more digital. So I think we're pretty excited at Remix to work now under the VIA umbrella and think about how we can make mobility and access even more accessible for all sorts of low income and non-car owners like myself. So this is just an example of what we're doing in Miami, where we're working together. So I know we're short on time, but I'm very excited to dig into this with all of y'all and talk about recovering from COVID.
Excellent. Thank you. And likewise, many, many things for our discussion to get back to and connect to. Alison, you're next.
Great. Let me get myself set up here. That was really exciting, for both of you, Bomee and Courtney. I was like on the edge of my seat, wanting to know what you were going to share with us. Okay. There we go. As Oliver said, I'm at Sidewalk Labs now. I'm heading up our urban development team. I have just been at Sidewalk for 4 months. So unlike Bomee, who's trying to unlearn saying we about NYCHA, I'm learning to say we about Sidewalk Labs. I'm really excited to be here. I think that Sidewalk Labs has a really interesting approach. One of the things that I've caught myself saying a few times is that being at Sidewalk Labs reminds me a lot about being at MIT. Like, I'm surrounded by both urbanists and technologists at the same time, which really very much characterizes my experience at Dust. So I'm really like loving it. To start with is sort of an lay out sort of the problem that Sidewalk has recognized, which is that, you know, urban systems, buildings, mobility, infrastructure operate and are built really in the same way as they were originally designed. There hasn't been a tremendous amount of innovation. If you look at sort of labor efficiency in different sectors, construction is the one where there's actually the least gains in terms of efficiency. We're really doing things in a lot of the same ways. There were different revolutions, and I'm sure everyone here who, if you took any Course 11 classes, about the steam engine, how it changed sort of the landscape, bringing electricity and an electric grid to cities, the automobile, and now today, and for at least the last 10 years, and for the next 30 years, we're going to be talking about the digital revolution, how it's impacted the way that we work in our cities, the way we work outside of cities, how we communicate with one another, and generally just sort of how we coexist. So Sidewalk Labs, is a for-profit company, but it's extremely mission-driven, which is one of the reasons that I was drawn to it. And we position ourselves as an urban innovation company that radically improves the quality of life in cities for all. And I think the three things that really stand out to me about this is that Sidewalk considers itself an innovation company, not just a tech company. I think there's a lot that technology can do, but it's not just about the technology. There are other solutions that may be less about the enhancement in tech and more about the way that we use it, or just generally other sort of programmatic opportunities to change the way that we work. The second thing is that we want to radically improve. Sometimes it's radical incrementalism, but it's not something where we just want to sort of do a little bit of business as usual, maybe slightly define ourselves, but we really want to have a true impact. And then the third thing, which is maybe the most important, is we want to do it for everyone in cities. This is our equity, inclusion, and diversity commitment. And I have sort of made it a point in the last 4 months to include this in every presentation I give, only because I think that it's so important for companies, especially companies with a lot of influence. And Sidewalk Labs, as one of the other bets, an Alphabet-backed company, I think has a larger megaphone than some other companies might. And so it's really important for us to kind of put this front and forward. So for us, this commitment is about sort of the way of working internally to the company, like how we hire people, how we promote people, whose voice gets heard, whose voice doesn't get heard, how we treat one another. But it's also about grappling with the social complexities of our work. You can see that's in our 5-year vision. So really understanding the impact of our work product and trying to tailor our work so that it has the positive impact that we're seeking. So my team has something that's relatively new for Sidewalk. In fact, you're getting a little bit of a sneak peek as our new website's rolling out at the end of the month, and we'll more properly introduce this to the world. But we have an advisory services business now, and that's what I'm leading. So primarily we're working with developers. We will work with municipalities, economic development agencies. But the overall idea is bringing to bear the tools and the learnings of Sidewalk from its past work, as well as sort of build this model, this engine for innovation, so that we're constantly working in place with partners, with clients, learning about real world constraints, finding solutions, and repeating. In order to do that effectively, we have to kind of have our eye on the prize. And for us, it's hard to reduce it down simply, but I think that these 3 interlocking circles do start to approach that. And the first circles are really about sustainability. It's about approaching climate positive, reducing vehicle emissions, and improving walkability. The second bubble is really about sort of inclusive development. It's about improving the well-being of all in the neighborhood. And then the third is about sort of that adaptability for the future, integrating all of these different ideas into something that's cohesive and practical. It's not useful to be ambitious if you can't also be practical. So that's about creating the optimal project for today while future-proofing for tomorrow. So our offerings as an advisory services are in these same buckets. You can see I kept the colors throughout: district sustainability, inclusive development, and integrated planning. And just a note on district sustainability or large-scale developments, it really varies depending on the context. We have clients who have 160 acres or 300 acres. We've talked to people about 30,000 acres, 80 acres. We're also talking to someone who has 2 acres. It just sort of depends on the complexity of the project and its location. But because Sidewalk spent a lot of time working in Toronto on a particular large-scale site, a lot of the technologies and things, products that we have are especially useful in those contexts. So just a few notes on like a little bit more specific. For our district sustainability approach, we're focused on these digital tools, mobility, buildings, and infrastructure. So for digital tools, I have in the top image here our moving graphic segments from Delve. So Delve is our generative design tool. It uses machine learning to iterate through thousands of scenarios for the design of a plan. So height, bulk, views, programmatic uses if it's residential, if it's commercial. And I think the thing that makes it really sort of unusual in the marketplace of products like this is that it backends into a pro forma. So while you're coming up with like your ideas for what the site should look like, you actually know if it's financially feasible or optimal. I also have high hopes for this as a tool to engage with stakeholders. I think one of the things as a developer that I've witnessed is that it's really difficult to have a conversation between developers, community, and city government that feels like it's transparent. And while tech can't totally solve that issue, I think having something where you can sort of jointly put in your desired outcomes and see it iterate in front of your eyes might provide like a useful tool in order to get closer to a better and more productive conversation. For mobility, one of the bottom image here is of a Pebble. So this is a privacy preserving device that you can, as you can see, very simply just pull off the adhesive back. I sound like an infomercial, put it down on the pavement, and it works. It has a magnetometer. So basically, if something big and metal goes over top of it, like a car, it knows that something's there and it turns on. So there are this is a way to understand where people are parking, when, for how long, and that information can feed back into either project planning. So what your peak is in the parking lot in phase 1, so you can build less parking in phase 2. It can also be used for dynamic curb management. We all know there's a lot of demand for our curbside, whether it's restaurants, parklets, freight drop-offs, delivery drop-offs, online ordering, cars, whatever it could be. And this is a way for potentially to use digital signage and other things to moderate and price the use of the curb more effectively. There are other tools that do this sort of thing, but I think it's worth just pointing out again that this is an approach that is meant to be different from approaches that use videos and other things to sort of track people, and not to say that those don't have their context in which that's the right kind of tool to use, but I think it's notable to me as a newcomer to Sidewalk how much time they spend thinking about sort of the responsible tech, the impact of AI that's unintentional on communities, and seeks way to create products that are responsible in that way. The third one is buildings. So we are setting up a mass timber factory. It's the viewpoint on it is, mass timber is obviously a hugely more sustainable way to build, although as I'm sure other panels will say, the most sustainable building is the one we already have. But if you're going to build a building, one out of mass timber is the way to go. Sidewalk's approach is to do that through modular construction, boiling it down to what we refer to as the kit of parts. It's these elements here that basically could form 65% of the building overall. I think the approach that Sidewalk is taking that is very different to me, I have done multiple kinds of modular construction, is that this is not volumetric. It is basically like a set of Legos that an architect can put together in just about any way. I think one of the interim CEO of the factory business likes to say that she walks down the High Line and pointing out, all of the buildings along there, conferring with the designers and engineers, they determined that they could actually make 9 out of 10 of the buildings from this kit of parts. The ones that are especially curvy are a bit of a challenge, but otherwise it's pretty flexible. And because it uses a sort of a digital approach, it has really high fidelity. They're working with designers of jet engines and so on and so forth to figure out how to really produce something in the factory that will fit and work in the field. The other thing is it can be flat packed onto a truck, so you're not dealing with sort of moving like those concrete shoe boxes around, which is definitely one of the modular approaches I've had the pleasure of using. And the last thing is infrastructure. So really thinking about, what are the ways we can approach electrification, as Bomee is an expert in, and make use of advanced infrastructure to advance our goals towards climate positive. The other thing I just wanted to touch on is our approach to inclusive development. This was a real driver in my coming to Sidewalk Labs, this sense that business as usual was really not enough. We have, very clear and apparent systemic racism in our country, and problems like this all around the world. And so, just doing affordable housing, which of course is very important, just doing job creation, which is also very important, is really not enough. So taking another approach. So the way that we look at it is through inclusive economic growth. So things like a neighborhood REIT or local asset ownership, shared equity programs, so that people who are in the neighborhood are not only financially aligned with developers, but actually experience a growth in income alongside the growth in value of their neighborhood. Broad affordability, which is looking at not only putting in affordable housing units, but making sure that someone can afford to buy a cup of coffee in the neighborhood. Community stewardship is moving away from consultation, asking people, oh, do you like A or B, and working towards co-design. And then responsible technology is, as I said, sort of thinking through the ethics of the work that we're doing. Overall, our objective is to really bring these things together in a way that is credible, that's practical, and yet ambitious, and can shape to the needs of the future. So I think just to add on to what the other panelists said in terms of the post-pandemic city, I think it's really taking this opportunity to leapfrog and double down on our commitment to things that advance climate adaptability, and also address like the clear and urgent need for more inclusive approaches to development. And part of that is mobility, moving people and giving them access to everything that's out there.
Fantastic, thank you, Alison. And you have, and all three of you have actually already almost covered that first part that I wanted to discuss. And this is kind of this moment where we are right now, after essentially a year of partial lockdown and restrictions of public life, and transformation, perhaps more of city life than of cities, and various reactions to this. At least in the US, I think we start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. The president announced today that the 200 million vaccination milestone has been reached, and at the same time, across the border in Canada, Ontario, I heard is a severe lockdown happening, and European countries are moving also in that same direction. So it's still a little not quite there to be able to say let's return back to our normal lives, but we certainly have at Gensler, and I'm sure and what you've shown us is reflective of all of this, asking these questions about what this means for the short-term future and also the long-term future, both in terms of have we learned something from this pandemic? Have we seen new things happening? Was this apart from the incredible hardship for many, also an amazing opportunity in this sort of reset momentum, and a lot of voices and discussion obviously going to, we learned through improvisation, we experienced things that we thought we wouldn't, because this is such an unnatural condition. How should we go about this? Is this like really a moment of opportunity and optimism now? And has this moment sort of afforded the ability to accelerate certain technologies that we thought would be way down the line? A popular example is that telemedicine, right, has seen a real surge out of necessity, but at the same time, people are likely to not completely move away from this after the possibility of personal medical visits is coming back. So maybe like Courtney, why didn't you start? Is there anything that you think is so significant in terms of these lessons that we've learned that it's worth sort of, as I heard earlier, doubling down on, right? Not let the moment pass and not go back to business as usual.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. think the first thing that comes to mind for me, and again, I'll have a slightly more transportation lens to this to start, is actually rethinking how we think about transportation delivery within cities. So, it seems like most of us had the fortunate ability to work from home. And I don't know what the return to work policies are for the various groups that we all work with, right? But there's a lot of wringing of hands of like, will the downtowns persist? And what does that mean? And I personally am quite bullish on people returning to the office in some fashion. I think in San Francisco, we've seen pretty significant commitments on that. But I do think it will change kind of the peak service that we've typically designed transportation around. So everyone goes to work at 9, everyone leaves at 5. I think that we actually might have an opportunity to change that for the first time in a really long time, which is actually really exciting to me because that service has historically been designed for, to be honest, like the male upper class office worker who is not thinking about all the trip chaining he has to do throughout the day to get his kids to school. And, it's actually a really interesting opportunity to rethink movement patterns and sort of time of day and where we allocate our resources. I do think the thing we need to double down on, which we got to experiment with a little bit more in COVID, is allocating street space to the people who need it the most. I think the worst case scenario, doomsday in my mind, is we all go back to work, but in our respective individual cars or taxis, and we just sit in traffic and create terrible congestion and emissions for everyone. It's interesting to think about how we can play congestion pricing into this at some point. But I think in San Francisco, at least, we've seen temporary transit lanes that were, historically, they were not official. It was just a pilot. We're just going to try transit only lanes in these areas. And we got to try it and we got to show how effective it was because we got the data before and after. Look, we saved, 20% time savings by having transit only lanes. Suddenly now everyone's really into them, right? So we get to keep them, which is, I think, a great example of something that we were able to experiment with here and hopefully double down on more so that we don't return to like the old way. I think in the Bay Area, at least, congestion has already returned to pre-pandemic levels, which is concerning to say the least. So I hope that we can use some of the lessons we learned from that and also just think about space. Who are we allocating space for cars or for people?
Yeah, thank you. And Bomee, maybe we switch over to you in terms of like the policy making aspect of this and the thinking about that city that we should return to, both from the aspect of perhaps even investments that need to be taken and preparation for the startup, especially in New York City, to perhaps also, when we talk about the value and the sort of new appreciation of public open space, and I think in your nature examples, I guess that's a paramount question that has always been on our mind in terms of the open space between or on nature property, right? So all of this together, what's your take on kind of that return moment to normal city life?
Sadly unsurprising, but nonetheless disheartening to know that, when you look at New York City's map, the places that have high ass.
I think, Bomee, you're cutting in and out, and your image is frozen. Is it just on my end, or?
Yeah. It's probably me. They're probably watching TV downstairs, and this is actually a demonstration of the thing that I was gonna say next. So my first point was the same people who are, who had the most burdens in New York City continue to have the most burdens under COVID also, right? So that's just a fact that we have to grapple with as we, figure out how to get back to, a new normal. I think that before I want to address the open space thing, but there are just two things that really struck me as sort of, things that really ought to come out of the pandemic, and it remains to be seen whether it'll happen. One is, my video and audio are glitchy because we don't consider connectivity to be a utility, really, right? We think it's like a nice to have, it's a luxury to have high speed access to broadband. I think that, the COVID really has shown us that it really ought to be a given, right? So like if my electricity were going in and out right now, it wouldn't just be an inconvenience. It would be like, oh my God, the world is ending. Like if my water cut out, that's a major disaster. my video, like the fact that we don't have reliable broadband everywhere, to everyone, I think is a big economy-wide problem. And I hope that we continue to look at it that way, and that we actually devote resources to make sure that all of those needs are met across the board as sort of a utility-like service. There's so much to that. But anyway, the second thing that I hope we keep thinking about through COVID is we never really thought that much about air, right? Before COVID, I mean, like normal people, I mean, engineers, I'm sure at Gensler thought a lot about air, but normal, like, lay folk, like citizens, like regular, like civilians like me, we just didn't think a lot about air. One of the things that I really think the time has come for is to think about compartmentalizing air within multifamily buildings in particular, because everyone, I think, in New York has the experience of being able to smell like, oh, my neighbor is, cooking something hopefully delicious smelling and not something noxious smelling. But, I know what's going on down the hallway there. I can hear things going on. Like all of that is indicative of air movement between apartments. Now we know that now that we're conscious of that, maybe we should build that into our definition of housing quality, that you really ought to have compartmentalized air for your apartments. I only know of one person in the city of New York who builds that way as of course. Like that's what they do all the time. That's one builder that I know of who does that. I think that's something that we really need to look at closely. And then just on the question of open space, NYCHA actually has been doing a lot of really great work on open space in recent years. We looked at from a number of different angles. One of them, we have a NYCHA. I'm still saying we. I guess they'll just be we to me forever, just like my children are my children forever. But so NYCHA has a climate adaptation plan coming out very soon, or maybe it's even out. I'm actually not sure. It's sometime this week, I think, was sort of, or maybe this month is the plan. But as part of the research for that, they looked at, well, what are the ecosystem services that are being delivered by the open space, and how are they impacting building performance? How are they affecting the perception of space and temperature by people, what have you? There's also a really innovative, people-centered urban design effort called Connected Communities that NYCHA has been running for the past couple of years. It's an award-winning effort, and we designed a number an approach to space. I think that's really the important thing. It's not the number of spaces that it's actually engaged with, but the approach to the space has been very people-centered and resident-centered and collaborative decision-making, and that sort of power sharing that Alison was alluding to. So I think that these things are going in the right direction. And of course, as far as NYCHA, all public housing is concerned, the constraint has always been, and continues to be, that as a country, we don't have a solid commitment that every person who lives in the United States should be housed. And so, I think lacking that political commitment across the board, we've never really, or at least for the last several decades, we haven't come anywhere near providing the right amount of resources to make sure that every person in America is housed. So all of these, I would love to see is for all of this to go really big, and for us to really stand behind fundamental commitments like housing quality means the best building that we can build today, not the best building that we thought was code minimum 5 or 10 years ago, but the best building that we have the technology for, having a commitment to housing as a right, having a commitment to things like broadband.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a lot here that needs strong leadership and political and public will, and then a private sector that can come along with it. And just as a side note, what we're doing at Gensler right now is with our commitment to basically say by 2030 we're going to be in a position to design our projects carbon neutral. We're discovering that it's not just about knowledge of building technology or design process. It's the entire system. It's manufacturers. It's sourcing of material. It's the embodied carbon question. That's largely a field that needs a lot of research and transparency in order to actually make this a reality. But to the point of systems, and Alison, I heard you speaking about this sort of comprehensive picture on urban systems, and we realized quickly that you can never look at one thing without considering the other as well. And a lot of questions are really being raised about the future of, right, the future of central business districts, the future of how we work together, how we live. If retail in the form we knew will continue to exist in the same way in the future. So I guess in this kind of like return moment, there's the problem of complexity, and then also the added uncertainty. How confident do you feel that this is about the vision that you laid out in all its aspects, and what do you feel you need to do to convince stakeholders that it's about that the awareness of the complexity and considering all of these elements in solutions that are being put forward as that new way of planning or the return to the city?
I think that people really experienced the challenges of all of these systems through the pandemic. It's a little bit less about convincing them that it's complex, like they already know that. It's a little bit more about convincing them that we can approach it in a way that we can find solutions and we can simplify elements of it. I mean, not every project is going to hit it out of the park on every single attribute. It would be great if they did, and that's what we should be working toward. But the mass timber building approach, for example, is a great way to address sort of embodied carbon. But there may be a project where that doesn't make sense for some other reason, or part of the site is efficiently built that way and part of the site isn't. But that doesn't mean that they can't stop and think about sort of the mobility aspects of it, like how are they connecting to the bus lines, what do they need, what kind of information do they need in order to like get a new bus stop, because it's going to fundamentally support the group of people that they are expecting to come live in that development. I think one of the shifts that we've seen with our client base, and recognizing that our client base is a little bit of a self-selected group, you don't come to us necessarily for like business as usual, is that seems to be a real curiosity about new models for retail. There's a recognition that retail offers goods and services that people want. It also provides like an activation of space, which makes spaces feel safer. It allows for us to like interact with one another. And despite the fact that we are barely interacting with each other now in the ways that we used to, I think we all want to be again. And so we want a future where we don't just go back to our own houses and homes and do our work and then see each other briefly in the park and then go back to our little selves, but we want to have more opportunity to engage. And so I think one of the things that we're seeing is an interest in models that are like sort of neighborhood owned amenities. How do you, instead of having like every single residential building having its own gym inside that's just for its residents, how do you connect with an existing gym that's in the neighborhood? How do you build a connection to a local coffee shop? Maybe within like, I'm just going to make this up, there's a coffee shop and they have like 10 seats. Could 2 of those seats be reservable on sort of a community app so that like before you go whether or not you're going to be able to sit there for 2 hours and do work or not? And as part of that reservation system, do you pay a small fee to be part of like a membership community? If you do something good for community, do you get credit so that you don't have to necessarily have the cash in order to participate in that sort of digital neighborhood amenity? But I think just broadly, like there are ways that we're thinking about retail that are a little bit different and that are really very much focused on either providing a good that you need that you don't want to wait to get, providing an experiential moment in your day, which is I think the direction a lot of retail was going when we saw all of those like Instagrammable sort of like pop-up shops. And then more, and I think this is a result of the pandemic, like really focusing on like what's sort of the community, the human interaction that's provided for by this particular space.
Yeah. Fantastic. Maybe I wanted for a moment before we open this up for audience questions, and the questions are coming in, so that's fantastic. Keep it coming. We'll have a lot to talk about in this third section. But a little bit back to the title, Smart Urban Planning for Post-COVID Cities, and both from the perspective of the word smart planning, as well as the maybe overused expression of smart city, and whether or not it's time to either rephrase our understanding about what a smart city is, and how perhaps we can give it a little bit more depth and make it more comprehensive, because we heard you all talk about, that this future city we go back to is experiential, it's human-centric, it's inclusive and equitable, it's about the built environment as a stage for urban life, and how people live it and make space for nature. We heard that mentioned, and certainly it's also about how smart technology interacts with infrastructure and places, and make these sort of accessibility to places facilitates that in a way. Courtney, if you were to define what the smart city is, what would you say?
Yeah, great question. So I think, my personal opinion on this, we can debate this all we want. I kind of have a negative reaction when I hear the word smart cities, because I think it conjures up, and you always see like a slide where just like everything has a device with like a little like Wi-Fi symbol, and everything is speaking to each other. And there's like never people in that world. And I don't know, I've been to my fair share of smart cities conferences that I'm not saying the technology there was not very interesting, but it's also just not, I feel like the things that I'm thinking about today are like urban planners are thinking about like right now. Like, I think people should be working on autonomous vehicles. I think they should be working on IoT devices, but I also think there's more pressing and urgent needs today. So I would say actually, in my mind, a smart city is like a prepared city. So I think there are ways that cities can set themselves up for adopting new technologies, but like kind of stating their values and the rules of engagement up front, so that you don't have, what's happened in the past where like scooters just got dumped on cities because cities didn't know how they wanted to adapt new mobility modes. And now we're sort of getting to a comfortable place, but I think there's actually an opportunity there to improve procurement, everyone's least favorite topic, and how you want to set up pilots. Like, I think cities should actually have really strong opinions about how new companies should engage with them and make it really easy. And I think a lot of cities are still a little bit behind from that perspective. So I think to be really smart, worry a little bit less about the AV pilot demonstration and think more about like, what do you actually want to happen in your city, and how can you guide that, from the people that you're engaging with.
Yeah, and maybe from the perspective of this sort of smart planning and process, I think and I think I mentioned this earlier, that's the sort of tension between both the smart planning as a policy tool, as well as the smart planning from a technology and process ability. And maybe if we go to that latter part first, obviously, like this Delph tool has gotten or is getting a lot of attention, and it's certainly a trend that in the architecture world also is prevailing with the move to parametric modeling, and the idea I think with energy simulation we've already been there, right? Like we create digital twins on a building scale that gives us indications about whether or not something is not working in real life. But I think the point that I want to make is like what is the let's say the function of the designer in this context. I personally feel that what becomes important really is the creative selector of the options that you're getting offered, and because it's created by an algorithm based on underlying input, it affords you the ability to take a look at counterintuitive solutions, which I think is super interesting because it lets you look at, oh, I did not expect this, whereas if I'm the author or something, I kind of only come up with what I expect to be there. Are there memorable moments in kind of the application of this type of tool that where you had really, with clients that you work with, real aha moments of like, oh, this has led to a solution that wasn't expected?
I love that you're thinking about it that way. Yes, in fact, I was just talking about this sort of issue with some team members yesterday. We were talking about building typologies, and architects often have, and developers use, in my experience, like sort of these rules of thumb. So like, how wide is a building ideally if it's a double loaded corridor, and how does it fit on the site? So when, as a developer, you're doing like an early feasibility study, you know what floor area you're allowed to build, and then you sort of look at the parcel and you say, like, can I fit that on there? Can I not? You run some numbers, and if he doesn't get past that stage, then it doesn't usually get on farther to the point where you actually can engage a design team to look at it further. And one of the interesting things I think about the Delve tool is that it, is how it can iterate options that sort of take advantage of those typical building typologies, but it can also sort of explore the things that are not as typical. So one of the things I'm thinking of right now that comes to mind is we were looking at a site that is in the Boston area, and the site was a bit of, I guess, a triangle, and the buildings were maybe like 1 or 2 stories, and then Delve was suggesting in one of the thousands of iterations some towers that came off of the podium, and they weren't the angle at which they were set were not the angle that I as a developer would have thought like, oh, that makes sense. I would have said like, well, that that doesn't conform to this sort of the street frontage, like that's a bit odd, like what are the views going to be between those apartments? But what we realized that Delve was doing is that we had asked it to optimize for sun and so it was optimizing for sun. And that's not maybe the way that we were thinking of it. So I think that it could definitely do that. The other thing that brings to mind is one of the other companies in which we consider to be a strategic partner, and which came out of the Media Lab, is a company called Ori that does robotic furniture. And one of the theories with Ori is that you can make a unit that is smaller or more differently shaped than we might normally assume would be efficient by use of this highly efficient sort of furniture that can, there's something called the cloud bed where the bed goes up into the ceiling. There's something called the pocket office where it basically just looks like a bookcase, and suddenly magically you push a button and you've got this gorgeous office. And so in exploring that with, an architecture team, we thought, what if we made units that were shallower, but had better exposure to along the window. But normally we would say like that's not deep enough to fit, all of these things that we would normally want to fit. Now maybe we can fit a double loaded corridor on a site that we didn't think we could before. So all those things can kind of start to work together. But just one other point I wanted to make, which is I think that you started with, and I want to emphasize, is that, and I think goes to like the smart city, is that Delve is not going to tell you what the best option is. It's not going to like iterate through thousands and then like present you on a platter like this is the one you should build. It's going to give you options to consider, and you do need those humans, those experts, whether they're community stakeholder experts or architecture experts, to say like this is what makes sense for this site and here's why. And I liken it to like something like Excel. Like Excel did not remove the need for accountants or other people who work, with calculators and numbers. It just created another tool to move more quickly.
And perhaps also the possibility of be just more sophisticated in the dialogue that you're having, right? You don't need to abbreviate, and you can work with more material. But Bomee, just returning to you for a moment, this idea of you talked about the climate adaptive city and the advances in energy efficiency and material management and all these types of things, from the perspective of technology or smart building technology. Are we? I mean, I tend to always think that technology is at the right spot when it disappears and it becomes sort of a natural extension about how we go about our day-to-day life. And in context of like housing, for example, are we in a better spot now to kind of reach those goals of climate adaptivity in buildings and the underlying smart technology? Is that what would be your sort of next technical innovation that needs to happen that sort of supports that whole agenda?
Yeah, that's a big question. So first of all, I am very optimistic based on just I just feel there's such energy in the space. And the thing that's important to me is not that just that the people that I've worked with all my career, and like Alison, are energized about climate. It's that firms that otherwise haven't really been talking about sustainability and energy are now energized as well. And there is a simultaneous mobilization across different economic sectors that is being seen as being integral to achieving a shared goal, which I think is, all of that is super exciting to me. I think that, just to harken back to something that Alison said in her original presentation, I just want to circle back to this idea, and also sort of picking up from where she just landed, right? In terms of, the technology is great, the doodads, the IoT stuff that Courtney was talking about, that's all great, sexy, whatever, it's great. It makes great renderings, right? And everything. But at the end of the day, the point I think that all of us have made is it's you have to make value decisions about how you're going to use all of these tools. And so, to me, it's sort of like all of us as practitioners need to be thinking about, how do we apply this idea of climate justice in the work that we're doing? And so just to give you a completely, non-NYCHA example, I have been for the last 15 years and continued mostly to be a building person. Like I am a person who looks at residential multifamily buildings. And because of that, I've been almost entirely in the sort of the from a utility perspective on the demand side of the equation, right? We're consuming, we're not generating for the most part. And I think that one of the things that's really happening that's quite exciting, but is a moment to think about climate justice is, we're now talking about how do buildings act as a component of the electrical system, right? We're talking about grid responsive buildings and all of that, all of the technology that entails. I have no doubt that that's coming, right? The doodads are upon us. Like it's going to happen, right? There's a bunch of things that they need to figure out, obviously, on the utility side. They're going to figure it out. There's a lot of money going towards it. There's a lot of smart people going towards that. What I think about, though, is as being like a value conversation moment is let's talk about grid responsive buildings and sort of this idea of the virtual power plants and what have you. Well, how are the folks who are in low-income communities going to benefit from that, right? And are we asking that question right at the front, right? Or are we thinking about it in terms of, sort of large commercial portfolio owners who are obviously going to be interested because there's money involved. It'll help their bottom line. But how are we thinking about it so that we throw that tent wide, right? So for example, I had a chance to go listen to or watch a video that was posted on the MIT, I think, Dust website, actually. And it was talking about how, the need is to throw a big tent so that the edges are covered. And if the edges are covered, so is the middle. It's not a donut, it's a tent. And I think that that's really the spirit in which we need to approach these really critical, like value-laden decisions that have to happen up front is how do we cover the edge first? How do we design it so that it covers the edge? And then, everything else is, are interesting technical problems, basically.
Yeah. No, that's fascinating. Fantastic. So we've gotten, like, questions are now really flowing in, and I will try first one thing to try to group some of the questions that we make sure we address most of those. And there's certainly a group of questions that goes to the data portion of the smartness that we discussed. Anything from data ownership, transparency, who uses the data, and down to, I think, a very specific question about a COVID passport, whether or not that's a good idea or a bad idea. But I think it goes to the same group of questions that in order to facilitate a smart response, you have to collect the data, and then the question is immediately about the protocol, how you deal with this. Is this one of the big challenges that is unresolved? Is it can there be an ethical response to this? Can it be possibly a question that even touches on what we haven't talked about yet, and I wanted to make sure we reserve some time, is that whole new sort of activity, and Alison, you brought it up with your function at Sidewalk Labs about diversity, equity, and inclusion, the accessibility of places and the democratization of environments in the light of kind of a data landscape that affords the possibility of knowing things and reacting to this. Whoever wants to take this kind of set of questions first, please go ahead. What is the possibility here versus what do we need to really look out for?
Well, I could say a few things, but I welcome the other panelists to jump in too. I mean, I think that it's really important for companies, particularly in the sort of tech creation space, to have a point of view on responsible technology. That may be something that's coming also from, government at some point, but regardless, we should have sort of a point of view on what we're willing to do and what we won't, and be clear about those policies. I think there are, I'm forgetting unfortunately the name, but I can look it up and put it in the chat of efforts to sort of label in the public realm things that are collecting data in ways that are really easy for people to understand and to witness and to choose to engage with in some ways, or just at least be aware. Another thing that this brings to mind is some work done by another MIT grad who's also still at MIT now as a tenured professor, Sarah Williams. She released a book recently about data for good, and I saw her give a little presentation, and one of the case studies that really stood out to me from some of her work was I think it was in Nairobi. It was working in a community that barely had really like anything in terms of like guarantee electricity or running water, those sorts of things, and yet like oftentimes the government would come in with very little notice, like tear down a bunch of homes and put up a road. And so one of the things that they were doing is helping to establish these sort of Wi-Fi hotspots that were powered by solar, and every time someone from the community wanted to log into it, they had to answer a survey question. And that survey question helped them then sort of provide information back to the community about what was happening. So for example, like, is there construction by your house today? Yes or no? Is it too hot where you are today? Yes or no? Like very sort of simple, straightforward questions that allowed them to sort of crowdsource this information that was useful back to the community. But the thing about it, overarching, which I think more responds to your question, is that data was all owned by the community. So the way that they found to finance that and to structure that internet access was in a way that the community has power over their own data. And if someone else wants to come in, even if it's like some other like large scale NGO, and they want to know like what sort of this is survey information that you're collecting and where are people going, they have to pay the community in order to get that. So I think that's another approach.
I actually have a couple of thoughts about this too. I think one thing that we've noticed at Remix working with cities is there are a few cities that are, I think, really forward thinking about data and data privacy. And so, if you look up chief data officers in the US, I think there's like 15 or something like that. And they've done a lot of work in thinking about what are the data principles we want to have, privacy. I mean, obviously in California and in the EU, there's some more intense sort of legal things that we have to respond to regarding like CCPA and GDPR. But I do think that's something that cities could improve on, is like thinking through how they want to handle issues of data ownership and data security and all of that. Sometimes they can do it in-house, sometimes they want to partner with someone. I don't really have a strong opinion on that, but I think the preparation thing, back to my smart cities comment, is like really key for thinking about all the data sets that are going to come in. But the other thing we've noticed at Remix is there's quite a reluctance, I would say, from cities to rely just on sort of new data coming in, because as we've noticed, it's not equitable. So if you have data from your smartphone bike tracking device, there's a real sense in the industry that might be only representing a certain population of bike riders, right? So like, do you want to optimize for that data set, or do you want to include and harmonize that data set against the counts you have by the manual person standing at the count? I'm not like, advocating for surveys because they're very expensive, but people do them and you're going to have that data. So we want to be able to reconcile those things together. And I do think there's a bit of a missing gap right now. I think from like super, super big data, new data sets, GPS connected car device stuff, and also some of the more sort of basic surveys, automatic passenger counter type data sets. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in the in-between to bring those two together. I do think there are real questions about the facial rec and sort of GPS tracking though that are sort of, it's an ongoing conversation. I think I actually participated in a Sidewalk Labs conversation around this. It was really fun. Like a workshop a couple of years ago, like how should we alert people that they're entering a space that might have some sort of digital tracking or something like that. Like there's ways that we as urban planners can actually think through how we want to create those spaces.
Thank you. There's another set of questions that sort of roughly addresses this tension between the technology that's available and the methodologies that we know how to deploy in order to create smarter environments, both from an energy perspective as well as from a mobility perspective. But they very often, at least in very specific cases, are not being deployed or value engineered out. And so we don't take full advantage of what's out there. And there was, Bomee, one specific question about technologies that NYCHA had hoped to implement in the electrification project that didn't make it to an actual implementation. Is that something you can talk about?
Yeah, I can't speak to the procurement specifically, but what I will say is it wasn't what I was referring to in terms of lessons learned really weren't about technologies that got value engineered out. There's nothing that we were expecting to see that we didn't see. So from that perspective, I think it was a great success because we were doing that large scale electrification project so that we could get a lot of innovation kind of crammed in through into one procurement, as it were. Because to Courtney's point, procurement. We wanted to get a lot of value out of that procurement. But what I think that, in terms of lessons, and this kind of goes to the other question regarding electrification, one of my big takeaways was the extent to which folks in real estate and just normal people, regular people, like non-energy industry people, we are very disconnected from the regulatory process that governs electricity and utilities generally, but particularly in the context of electrification, just the electricity, the way that the tariffs are set, the proceedings that are used to get to those tariffs that are adopted. I think that there's a lot that gets decided in those tariff conversations that are really inaccessible even to professionals, right? Because it has its own corner of, they use their own language. And there are things that are happening at those tables that limits what you can do as an owner or as a developer. And we are not part of those conversations, right? And so there are conversations that ultimately have to do with how the costs of electrification are going to be distributed among to use utility speak, ratepayers, right, customers. But those are all, those conversations are all being had by folks who actually do that for a living. One of the things that we discovered in looking at electrification was that it requires a different way of looking at utility service. So, for example, I'll give you an electricity example and then an IT example. If you're going to do an electrification project and you, for whatever reason, can't electrify everything all at once, right? So, for example, you're going to do heat and hot water. You're not going to do your stoves yet. You have gas stoves. You're going to leave your gas stoves. You're going to come back and do your gas stoves later. Induction, there is no, in New York City right now, you can't ask for service that you anticipate having a need for. You have to ask for the service that you immediately could show on your plans that you're doing. And so just even the mentality of the sort of phased movement towards electrification isn't something that's accounted for in the utility processes. The other, and just in terms of the efficiencies that you're leaving on the table. So there's the electricity side, but it's kind of a similar kind of ballpark thing happens on the networking side as well. So for example, we're gonna, over time, residential buildings, commercial buildings, we are gonna put in the doodads. Like the IoT stuff is gonna show up. They're gonna have a need for connectivity. It is, I don't know the numbers on this, but I would imagine probably greatly more cost efficient to just pull that connectivity once and provide the little bit of pipe that those devices need, and then the big fat pipe that the users need for things like watching Game of Thrones or whatever folks are doing in their homes now, right? It's better to do that project once. We don't want to go in there and fiddle with them multiple times, but we're not thinking in these sort of holistic ways in terms of how do we get these things paid for, right?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So there are a bunch more questions here. Some are very, very specific, but will again, maybe one last attempt to group questions, and certainly about so the complex of, and they're connected or possibly not connected, but this, the balance between, first of all, density, future of density in a post-COVID city, or density as part of something having, is desired as a necessity for urban environments to be able to live with shared infrastructure, but at times seen as perhaps a health threat. And certainly an outcome that we've seen is people moving away from New York City or other dense places to, we've seen second-tier cities benefiting from people coming in. Is there this idea of density in the context of post-COVID? Is that something to hold on to or change or focus on with future planning policies?
I'll start. I think that, first of all, I think density is a little bit relative. If you look at like efforts in really Los Angeles comes to mind with the ADUs in the rear yards, that's a way to create density that doesn't mean like a 40-story tower. So I think that, approaching density can be done in different ways and meaningful ways. I think the efforts by some municipalities, including like Minneapolis, to end sort of single lot zoning is a really big step forward in equity and in sort of the, our approach to climate change. I mean, cities have been around for like 5,000 years. It was maybe, when was it, like 10 years ago, 11 years ago, that more people on Earth live in cities than don't live in cities. I think even those who are moving outside of the larger sort of gateway cities right now, that's a trend that had started pre-pandemic. Maybe it accelerated for some, but I don't think that those cities have become irrelevant by any means. Probably this is a good release valve a little bit to bring down the cost of living a little bit. But a lot of those people are still relocating to places that are within the vicinity of a city. One of the things that we're seeing an increase in are clients who are looking to redevelop shopping malls, like those big internal facing shopping malls with seas of parking around them are not as relevant now. So now they're interested in sort of these mixed use 20-minute neighborhood communities. So that's bringing a different kind of density to the site that didn't exist before. I'll pause there.
And maybe Courtney, if we take the same question related to transportation and or mobility in general, right? Like mass transit has always been basically dependent on ridership, and there are simply sweet spots of density that are required in order to support mass transportation. Are there future mobility paradigms also in the context of what you're doing that how sort of open up new places, less denser environments that still are accessible? Is that how we can understand these new mobility patterns to evolve?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing about density that I think Alison noted at the very end was like just thinking about how much space is allocated to parking. within cities today. Like if you look at surface lots, and I don't know, I'm sure New York has, so many parks. San Francisco has so many parks. Those have been real lifelines, I think, during this time, just rethinking about allocating that space to better and greater use, or even curbs or streets. I think that's something that's also a density kind of change that I actually think is very pro and people would be very open to. I personally am bullish on the long life of cities. As Alison mentioned, they've been around forever and have endured through various things. I think from a mobility perspective, there's an opportunity to experiment now, which is kind of fun. I still think fixed route, high frequency transit is the ideal. That is like the best way to move a lot of people. But I do think realistically, if you look at, unfortunately, American land use patterns, there are not a lot of places that really encourage that. And so we see, it's always like what the butter and toast analogy is, that you like take the resources you have and you spread them out really thin. And it's kind of a bummer, right? You get like our headway bus service that doesn't really go very, anywhere. And so I think there is an opportunity to think about reallocating service into other ways. So, now we have a few more solutions. Like I mentioned, VIA sort of is very much moving into the space, thinking about not just first last mile connection, but maybe different communities have a different appetite for different types of bus service. Maybe there is an opportunity for a 15-passenger van that can serve an area that previously really only had a bus every hour. And actually this will be even better for them because it will come every 30 minutes. And it's still better than them driving across town, right? So I think then you can take that bus service and allocate it to the downtown core that is actually very busy and could actually use more social distancing by having more buses running more frequently. So I think we saw a lot of that in some of the Remix customers during COVID, people reallocating service hours from, lesser used services to the more like frequently essential worker services. I think there is definitely an equity question. And so that's why I think some of the trans agencies thinking about bike share, or, New York City is about to get scooters, right? So I think trans agencies have to think more broadly about mobility now than they did before. Because unfortunately, I have taken the subway. I don't think everyone has the same appetite for that as, maybe I did, but not everyone's going to want to do that. I think that is a reality. Unfortunately, you can say BART has better air cleaning than others, but not everyone's going to feel like that. So transit agencies kind of have to think like, okay, transit is one of our tools. What are the other things we have that we can use to encourage people to get out of their cars and move? But I think ultimately it is a land use question. We have to be able to rezone places to encourage walking. So that right. It has to work in partnership.
Yeah, I think again, it's what we talked about earlier, the idea that urban environments are systems and one thing relates to the other. And if we can create, the 20-minute neighborhood or the 50-minute neighborhood, then certain needs for mobility certainly change. And technology has the ability to also sort of accommodate the demand for mobility and perhaps get to a picture where more choices emerge, where where it's not about mobility is not a need, it's a want, and perhaps even in the autonomous world, when someone goes about structuring their days, the idea that going from A to B is just one element in a set of experiences that don't necessarily focus on you moving, but they allow you, while you're doing it, to take care of a number of other things that in kind of the current paradigm are just not possible this way. So there's certainly more to come and to discuss, but maybe one more shift to a number of questions here regarding to mass timber and the CLT and the new way of construction and building. Anything from concern how this relates to affordable housing, as well as whether or not there's such a demand for future timber for construction across the board that that this may stop to be a viable option for environmental reasons. And it's certainly a concern, but we also right now we're in this crazy situation where the timber prices are skyrocketing. Bloomberg City Lab had an article just yesterday about the fact that the tree farms in the south are still not getting more money for the trees that they cut. But timber, when you go and get your 2x are 5 times as high as they were just a couple of years ago. But regardless of this, the focus on the material and certainly the advances in using this material more efficiently through CLT. Do we have to look at a balanced picture, and are we gonna, like, is it feasible to think about future cities entirely built from this material?
Well, I think from a technical perspective, there's no reason we couldn't have a city fully built from CLT. The sort of sourcing issue of, do we have a sufficient sort of forestry supply, is hard for me to answer. I don't think that it's a long way from here to there. But in terms of utilizing mass timber more broadly, it is part of the IBC code for 2021 that you can build mass timber building up to 18 stories. They're actually incredibly flexible. They have a high degree of sort of fire safety because of basically the char that occurs when the wood starts to burn, which actually slows down the process. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that, if we can produce mass timber efficiently and effectively, it would be the same cost or less than conventional approaches. It's not, the goal isn't to create a new stream of building products that are more expensive. The goal is actually to find a way to make it comparable so that there is a desire for builders or something in it for them to change over. And will that be in the beginning? I think probably it's unlikely. I think we need to get up to scale in terms of production in the US. And also we need to make sure that there are enough skilled workers who know how to work with a different building material. I think there's thousands and thousands of people who know how to build a pour-in-place concrete building. They can certainly learn how to assemble a mass timber building, but like anything else, it takes time to learn. There's a learning curve to do that. So I think the rollout of mass timber will take time. I think some cities are farther ahead than others in terms of having adopted that code. There are other cities are sort of on the precipice of adopting it. Maybe they have a preference for smaller buildings at the start. But I think there's a great deal of opportunity there.
Yeah, I believe so too, because I think especially when you focus on mass timber and you plan a mass timber building today, you realize that even manufacturing facilities are far in between. There aren't that many. And when it comes to the skilled labor to be able to erect those buildings, I think we have a lot of catch up to do. So we're very close to the end of our time, and I think we answered most of these questions. There are a few detailed ones that we certainly can follow up on individually. But I wanted to thank you for your valuable contributions today and your insights. It was an amazing conversation that we had, and would like to invite you perhaps like one last sentence, a parting sentence to any of the things that we discussed. Is there anything that you would like the audience to walk away and think about more, perhaps to contribute to this kind of like smart aspect of planning in a post-COVID world?
I'll go first. I think that one thing that I would like to just sort of note is how like inspiring and fun it is to have this conversation with the three of you. Like you have so much to sort of offer on this topic, and it's a really fun representation of like what people are doing in this space and how thoughtful people are being. And I hope that we can take that and we can run with it, and we can really, meet the moment that we're facing.
Yeah, this was super fun. I have a challenge for folks, I guess, is to participate in a community outreach session. So it is easier now more than ever to, call in to a remote meeting or leave a comment on a map. And so we need to get out of this world where only the squeakiest wheels get, squeaky wheel planning, where like the people, it's like the Yelp issue, right? If you leave 1 star, it's because you had a bad experience, but you don't leave a 5 stars because you had a good experience. If you love your slow street, tell your transit agency in your city and help them build the case for making it more permanent. I think we need to be like more engaged citizens, and there's more ways to do that now than ever before.
Fantastic.
Yeah, this has been a lot of fun, and I think that I'm just really relieved that I think the takeaway message here is like, smart cities are about people, and I feel like we've risen to the occasion as Dustburs, to talk about, that we're talking about people and we're talking about distributional effects of decisions. So I hope that every discussion about smart cities ends that way, that smart cities are about people.
All right, that's a fantastic way to close this discussion. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to our audience to take the time after a very busy day until 7:30 our time here in New York City. So thank you very much, and goodbye.